My name is Stuart Elden. I'm a professor of political theory and geography at the University of Warwick. Welcome to my exp. Foucault makes a claim in some of his lecture courses that what we've seen in around the 17th century is a shift from a concentration of the object of government being over territory to the object of government becoming the population. And Foucault suggests that you can see this in a whole range of ways in which the population becomes the object, the thing to which governmental practices are directed. Now, Foucault says you can see that in the development of statistics, which is literally the description of states, but a numerical, calculative way of thinking about a population. You can see this in things like birth and death rates, the health of the population, crop yields, these kinds of questions. And Foucault thinks that population then becomes very much the focus of politics. What I suggest in my work is that actually the modern notion of territory is produced at around the same time as this modern notion of population, and that it is produced through many of the same kinds of techniques that Foucault identifies in relation to population. Statistics and distribution of population, it's distribution of population through a territory. The surveying, the mapping, the marking out of boundaries of states. This only becomes possible with the developments in mathematics, particularly in coordinate geometry, in the 17th century, and that these are the same kinds of things that Foucault thinks are central to the advent of population. So on my reading, territory and population are in a sense co-produced and around the same time and with the same kinds of techniques. And this is why I think that some of the things that Foucault says about territory, both in the historical period he thinks that we've gone beyond, where he characterises certain thinkers as having a focus on territory. On my reading, actually, those thinkers are not particularly focused on the question of territory, at least not in the way that we understand it today. And then Foucault suggests that some later thinkers do have a focus on population, but not on territory. Sometimes on my reading, actually, there is an interesting relation to the question of territory in their work. So in some ways, I think that the question of territory actually appears later than Foucault thinks it's actually displaced. The modern notion of territory, on my reading, is really a late 17th, early 18th century notion, similar, parallel to perhaps the way that Foucault understands the question of population. The most recent book I've written on territory is called Shakespearean Territories, and in that book I try to use different plays by Shakespeare to explore many different aspects of the question of territory. In previous work I've suggested that rather than looking for a single definition of territory, either the common existing one or a better one that I could come up with, instead what I've suggested is we need to look at the different registers, different types of questions that we need to ask in order to understand how territory has been understood and practiced in different times and in different places. So we need to look at political economic questions, property, land. We need to look at political strategic questions, so who controls land, what military force is going on there. We need to look at legal questions. What is the question of sovereignty or jurisdiction in relation to territory? What are the techniques that are used? Surveying, cartography, the census, statistics, and so on. I think that Shakespeare actually offers us a lot of material that can help us to think about those kinds of questions. One of the ways that we can understand Richard II, for example, is a play that is about the control, not just of territory, but also of land. Richard is accused of being a landlord of England rather than king. It's now leased out. It's like a tenement or a pelting farm. He's accused of this, of treating England as if it is some kind of private dominion of himself, rather than the land of the kingdom of which he is supposed to be the head. Territory continues to matter today in a range of ways. It dictates who you can vote for, which elections that you're able to vote. It dictates who you pay your taxes to. It dictates whether you have the right kind of passport that allows you to move across borders elsewhere in the world. Territory also shows in national allegiance, which flag, which football team. Territory matters, it continues to matter. Even in a so-called globalized world, territory is still something that actually marks out a whole set of rights that people have. Rights on this side of a river can be different to the rights that you might have if you were born, if you live, if you have citizenship on the other side of a river. And that we still use those territorial divisions to shape many of the ways in which contemporary politics and contemporary life is actually practiced. In some ways, we've seen that even more starkly in the era of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, in that one of the ways that states have taken to control and protect the health of their population has been to close borders. It's been most stark with, for example, Australia and New Zealand. It's been less stark in the United Kingdom, where the borders have remained fairly porous in terms of movement of people. But even borders that have been unmarked on the landscape for generations have in the COVID era actually been controlled and regulated. So the border between France and Switzerland, border markers often appeared in the middle of fields, on the middle of footpaths, on the middle of cycle paths, things that people didn't regularly notice as a border. But the territory of Switzerland, the territory of France had been marked out in ever stricter ways because of this pandemic and a global problem, but often having to be dealt by nation state governments.